The year is 2020, and it's the height of the pandemic. People are panicking. There are rumors that air travel is unsafe. People believe that if they so much as step foot inside an airplane, they're going to get sick with COVID immediately. But one thing we know for sure is that planes themselves don't really spread COVID very easily, and there's a reason for that. The plane's filters are specifically designed to remove viruses and other airborne contaminants from the air, making it safer for passengers and crew alike. In fact, the air quality on a plane is probably some of the cleanest air you can breathe, especially when compared to, say, the outside air or the air in your house. That is, unless you're on this flight. Welcome to this channel. Today we're answering the question, what actually happened to Vistara Flight 944? On January 13, 2020, a Boeing 787-8 was operating a scheduled domestic flight from Delhi to Goa in India. It was a standard flight. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At 6:05 p.m. UTC, the plane was cruising at 34,000 feet when the pilots turned on the autopilot system and selected the desired altitude of 37,000 feet. Apparently, they forgot to change the vertical speed mode from 3 degrees to 2 degrees. This is kind of important, but before we go into why, let's see how the flight went from normal to total chaos. At 6:09 p.m., about 4 minutes after they engaged the autopilot system, the pilots heard a bang. They felt some unusual vibrations, and then they saw a bunch of error messages pop up on their screens. The primary flight display and the multifunction display, which are both incredibly important systems, went down. Things were getting bad. Captain called for a mayday, and then he and the first officer started going through their checklists, trying to figure out what to do. A mayday is basically like the nuclear option of pilot emergencies. You only call it when you're in grave danger. To be honest, they might have been better off not calling it, because all of their attempts to restart the computer systems failed. They tried switching the battery from normal to emergency, but that didn't work. They switched the power from AC to DC, still nothing. Then the captain asked the passenger to turn off their devices and brace for impact. There was no way out of this. They had to land right now, or they'd be forced to ditch into the Arabian Sea. But here's the kicker. They had no idea why the plane was falling apart at 37,000 feet in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Thankfully, the pilots were able to land the plane without any injuries, which was actually against all odds. But the real mystery is what caused all of these computer systems to fail in the first place. Let's find out. Now the investigators knew exactly where to start, the malfunctioning autopilot. They ran tests on it, and they discovered that the problem wasn't with the actual computer system itself, but with the little tiny button that tells the autopilot system whether or not to engage. And that little tiny button was completely covered in ice. Now, the Indian aviation authorities had already issued a warning about this back in 2017. They sent out what is called a safety recommendation. It's basically just a memo saying, hey guys, make sure you're protecting this button from ice buildup. And apparently the airline had actually fixed this problem on some of their planes, but not this one. But why would a little bit of ice cause all of those systems to fail? Well, it's all about where that button is located. It's right next to another button that controls the bleed air doors. Basically, when you push the button that engages the autopilot, there's another button right beside it that regulates the plane's cabin pressure. When the plane started getting iced over, ice built up around that second button, confusing the pilots. They pushed the autopilot button, but because of all the ice, it also pressed the cabin pressure button. This caused the bleed air doors to open, which led to a rapid depressurization. And you might be thinking, what the heck does that even mean? Well, let us explain. Modern airplanes fly in the cold upper atmosphere where it's very low pressure. This means that if you were to crack open the door and let that outside air rush in, you'd literally be blown out of the plane. So instead, planes use something called bleed air. As the name suggests, they take some of the pressure from the engine and bleed it off into the cabin. This keeps the air inside the plane pressurized so that you don't explode, but it also works in reverse. If the bleed air system fails, then all of the pressurized air inside the plane will rush outside, rapidly decompressing the aircraft. And if that happens too quickly, it can lead to catastrophic damage. That's exactly what happened on Flight 944. The sudden depressurization knocked out all of the electrical systems. And you might be thinking, why doesn't the plane have a backup bleed air system? Well, it does. But here's the thing. The backup system is used for long-haul flights. On shorter flights like Flight 944, the backup bleed air system isn't even hooked up. It's disconnected. To be honest, it probably wasn't even on their checklist. They just didn't think it was necessary. Who would have thought that a little bit of ice could cause such a catastrophe? And that's all well and good, except for the small detail that the safety recommendation from 2017 explicitly mentioned that on short-haul flights, the autopilot buttons needed to be protected from ice buildup. They even drew a picture of the exact configuration that the plane should have been in to prevent this. And not only did Vistara choose not to equip the plane with the proper de-icing equipment, they also failed to adequately train their pilots on the safety procedures. But wait, it gets worse. When the plane landed, engineers checked out the damage and found that the leading edge flaps and slats were completely iced over. That's what caused the stall warning and the vibrations that the pilots felt. The icing conditions were so severe that it affected every single control surface on the plane. Every single one was frozen solid. As for the pilots, they did everything they could to save that plane. The captain even said, "I feel we have done everything right," and he was right. They followed all of the correct procedures and made all of the right calls. The captain declared the emergency, tried to restart the computers, shut down the autopilot, and alerted the passengers. He also told them to turn off their electronics to conserve the battery power, which allowed them to run the cabin lights and keep the emergency systems operational. The first officer also did her part. She kept her cool and helped the captain manage the crisis. Without her help, who knows what might have happened. Despite all of this, Vistara chose to ground both pilots for 6 months. Why? Well, they said that the captain should have recognized that they were in an icing condition earlier than he did. And that's kind of ridiculous. How is he supposed to know? Ice forms on planes when the temperature of the water droplets is above freezing, but the surface of the plane is below freezing. The temperature on the wings of Flight 944 never got below freezing, so he had no reason to suspect that ice would be a problem. The real blame lies with the company. They failed to implement the safety recommendations from 2017. They operated the flight in known icing conditions. They failed to adequately brief their pilots, and they even scheduled the flight for the worst possible time. According to the investigators, they should have left an hour and a half earlier or later, and they would have avoided all of those icing conditions. All of this could have been prevented, and the reason it wasn't is pure corporate greed. Safety comes cheap, but profits come cheaper. The truth is, most airlines won't implement safety measures unless they're forced to. And that's why investigations like this one are so important. Hopefully, by learning from this terrible accident, other companies can avoid making the same mistakes. Thank you for watching. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay safe.